We'd like to start today by acknowledging that we're on the unceded sovereign lands of the Gadigal people and pay our respects to elders past and present. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land.
Hey, welcome to So You're Disabled.
I'm Soph and I'm disabled and my pronouns are she, they.
I'm Tam. I'm living with a disability and my pronouns are she, her.
Well, welcome back. Episode 3.
Thank you for being here with us.
Yes, and today we're going to talk about how we identify.
You know, I think identity is such an interesting topic because identity refers to the many ways we describe who we are.
Oh, love that little pocket dictionary there.
Yeah, just like sort of tell us a little bit about what the episode will be about.
And I guess more specifically in this episode, we're going to be talking about our identity in relation to our disabilities. And so for me, I use identity first language, and I identify as disabled, as you may have noticed. Whereas
I identify with person first language, so living with a disability is obviously an example of person first language. And I do that for many different reasons, probably because of the shame that I experienced really in the way in which I was diagnosed and what the neurologist said to me, which is very scary and hard for me to be talking about. So I'm really trying here.
That's okay. We don't need you to share anything that you're not comfortable with because we wouldn't ask anyone who follows us or our friends to share anything they're not comfortable with either.
Oh, well, thank you, Soph, for making this such a safe space. And likewise, we want this to be a safe space for you too.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, I guess when we talk about identity, there are a number of different ways that people with disability will identify. And, sometimes people won't even want to have disabled or disability in their identity at all.
Yeah, absolutely.
They won't resonate with that at all. It's, as we spoke about in another episode, a problem that can be fixed or just not how they see themselves at all.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like it's definitely not a case of identity first versus person first or anything at all like that. There are so many different types of identifiers outside of those two. And I think one of my personal favorite is individualized identity. And so that's where, you pick whatever words work for you to describe your identity. So I think that's so cool. And I think a really great example of that is the late Stella Young, who used the word crip to identify herself, which was met with so much controversy. And I mean, I think that highlights how society is very uncomfortable with disability. But if we focus just on identity, I think it's so awful that anyone would place any sort of judgment on how someone chooses to identify. I think identity is like an entirely personal, thing and place to reach. And I don't think anyone has any right to place any judgment on that or to disrespect how you choose to identify.
Absolutely. I think that it's really a shame that there has to be conversations where people, what's the word I'm looking for? Where people have to validate or, have arguments about why they identify the way that they do. I think how someone identifies is a very personal thing. And, in particular, this makes me think of I'm autistic and conversations that happen a lot in the autism community. And there are people who identify with terms that the medical world consider to be outdated, but that is the diagnosis that they received sometimes many, many years ago, and that's how they've identified for many years since. And taking that away from them and saying that that's not okay and you can't identify that way can be a very distressing thing. So you really have to, I think, just appreciate that people identify the way they do because that's how it's most comfortable for them. If that makes you uncomfortable, okay.
I completely agree with you, Soph. I feel that, on your point about diagnosis, I think as well, no one has the right to make you feel like you can't identify the way you do, even if you don't have a diagnosis. So both, whether you've been diagnosed a very long time ago, and like Soph said, that terminology is now outdated, or if you haven't been able to get a diagnosis for whatever reason, no one has the right to, question you about that. And I think as well, we need to normalize that your identity, who you are, it changes over time. So the way you choose to identify can change. I mean, I think sometimes it can even change on a daily basis, and that's okay. It's just whatever feels comfortable and feels right for you.
Absolutely. I think, if we think about fashion for a second,
I love fashion.
Well, people obviously wear different things in different eras and different times in their lives. And I think, people will sometimes hold on to clothes that mean a lot to them, but otherwise let go of a lot of clothes over time because they don't fit anymore, or they've changed their opinion of those clothes and how that reflects their identity. Terms for identifying really are one and the same. Sometimes you'll hold on to one because it means a lot to you and you think it still reflects in some way who you are. But in other ways, other terms are not going to stay relevant to how you see yourself. I mean, I wasn't born with the pronouns she, they, yet here we are. So, yeah, I think that these identifiers can change as well, and that's okay. But it should never be someone telling you that how you identify is not okay. If they're concerned about you and how they think that the way you're identifying yourself is in a very negative way, I mean, sure, I guess that depends on the relationship you have. But also, I think to some extent, we need to hold respect for the way that people identify.
Well, that's what I think, right? I think that it is a form of respect to respect the way someone chooses to identify and respect that there are so many different layers of identity. So you may have multiple intersecting layers of identity that you choose to identify as, and that's perfectly okay. And if, as we said before, if someone has an issue with that, regardless of the place it's coming from, it's really just not up to them.
Absolutely.
Like, you need to be comfortable and happy with the identifier that you pick for yourself.
Absolutely. And so all of this to say, I also was not born with the label disabled. That is something that I have had a whole journey to get to and feel comfortable with. And likewise for you, living with a disability is not a term that you were born with, and there's been a whole journey of getting to that term, and we wanted to talk a little bit about those journeys.
Yeah, I think that they're very different journeys, but what sort of underpins both of them is this same sentiment of shame.
Yes, I think it starts with shame.
Yeah, absolutely.
For both of us, we got diagnosed first in our teenage years. And that's a hard moment in a adolescent life to have a diagnosis, and a heavy one, and to then try and make sense of that when your peers are not really capable of holding that space for you and supporting you through that either, because they have not got all of the parts of their brains fully developed. And so they say a lot of really mean things and they don't comprehend how that feels. So anyway, we've explored that in another episode, but I think that for both of us, the shame is something that we share and have talked a lot about and can really relate to each other on from the point of getting the diagnosis. and being like, well, no, actually, let's not worry about that. That's not part of who I am, and I'll just live kind of in spite of that diagnosis and not make it a part of who I am, because I don't want that. I don't want the shame. I don't want the embarrassment. I'm just going to live life outside of that.
Oh my God, yes. I lived literally in fear of anyone knowing that I had a disability. Up until very recently, I mean, I wouldn't even tell my close friends. Like, I remember I told one of my friends who I've known since I was 16, just at the end of last year. And she had no idea.
Yeah.
Like, I hid it so well.
Yeah. So I think that that's where our stories are very similar. And then we kind of take our own path and own journey from there to get to how we identify today. So for me, I then was, I guess, in university needing to access support, and I was able to get some amount of support. I'm not going to say that I think it actually met my access needs, but it was all that was on offer for me at university. And still, I thought to myself, I don't need to have the label. And it wasn't really until I was able to access more conversations with other disabled people and people with disability that I was able to realize that there is no shame in leaning into your diagnosis or leaning into being disabled, that's not something to be afraid of. It is actually also a part of who I am. And all of this time, really, all I've been doing is running from who I am. And I wanted to kind of hug that teenage version of myself and be like, you know what, nah, we're disabled and we're proud, and that's how it's going to be from now. So I fully embraced disabled because I also love watching people's facial expressions when I say that I'm disabled, and they look me up and down, they're like, oh. But aside from that, it also is something that I really am proud of, because I know that it is a part of who I am, but it's not the whole part of who I am.
I love that, Soph, and I am so proud of you for having reached this point. And I think all the more power for you to identify as identity first. For me, I think, as I said before, my shame very much happened the day that I was diagnosed. So I developed symptoms when I was 15, as I mentioned a couple episodes ago, but I sort of hid it from everyone because I was raised by ethnic parents, and you just sort of get up and you go to school and you don't complain. So it wasn't until I was 16 that I was diagnosed. So I remember I walked into the neurologist's office, and I mean, I was and still am now such a dreamer. I tend to romanticize so many things. I used to love Sailor Moon when I was a kid, and so I had this massive crush. Did you? I had this massive crush on Tuxedo Mask. I literally couldn't wait to the day that I would meet my very own Tuxedo Mask. I mean, as you know, I had crushes on celebrities and musicians too, not just cartoon characters. I hope. Anyways. But also, I walked into that office with all of these dreams for my career as well. But it felt like when I walked out, they were all just shattered because... So the neurologist told me that... So he diagnosed me and he told me that I was too sick to study and that I'd have to drop out of school, and I would be lucky if I would ever be able to study again. Sorry, that I'd have to drop out of school and that I'd be lucky if I'd ever be able to go back to TAFE. And so I internalized what he said to somehow mean that I was lesser than and would never be able to live a normal life. And so I just lived in fear of anyone ever knowing or finding out that I had a disability, because for me that meant that no one would ever want to be with me romantically, or that I'd never get hired. And I mean, I cried a lot, especially in the first year. And, although like I've come a really long way, like I'll be honest, like I still sometimes struggle with those fears. But I think it's because, of course, what he said really impacted me, but it's specifically because I feel in that moment, I was really reduced to my disability. Like I was just no longer a person anymore. And like my life sort of ended in that moment. And so that's why identifying as person first is so important for me, because it's my way of saying, hey, no, I am still a person. And there are so many layers to me and things about me separate and outside of my disability. And also it feels less scary and less daunting for me. And I think that's totally okay. So I know that there are critiques of person first language that claim that it reinforces that disability is inherently negative. But for me, it's the total opposite. It makes me feel empowered and makes me own my disability in a way that I'm both proud of and comfortable with. And that's why I go back to what I was saying before about how it's really important to reach an identifier that you're comfortable with. I remember my friends and family had opinions on what they thought would work for me, but I was like, no, like it's important for me to reach an identifier that feels right for me.
I think that's the whole point, right? Is that it's about finding what works for you and what feels best for you, what's most comfortable. And I appreciate that there are critiques of all of the different ways of identifying, but at the end of the day, how someone identifies is about what reflects best for them or what is most comfortable for them. And I don't think there can be a critique for that, because it's how you feel most comfortable in your body and what feels best for you.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Even just the fact that, to be honest, at first I picked person first simply because it did just feel less scary and less daunting, like I said, and that was sort of like the catalyst for why I chose to identify in that way. And that's absolutely okay, because prior to that I wasn't identifying with the term disability at all.
Yeah, and I think that the history of disability, especially in predominantly white societies, has a lot to contribute to why we internalized a lot of shame about even how we identify, because the history is full of, really discriminatory ways of thinking about disability. And I know you've researched it and you're going to give us a little spiel and history lesson now.
Okay, so I have done like the tiniest little bit of research, but unfortunately, given time constraints, it's all sort of centered on the Western world. But first, I'd just like to say that on Soph's point about like derogatory language, I think the history of disability is really intertwined with society and language. So around the late 19th century, with the rise of modern medicine and medical science, disability shifted from being viewed literally as people having been possessed by evil spirits to being an impairment. So what that meant was that a lot of derogatory language was normalized and used to identify and refer to disabled people. And then it wasn't until the civil rights movement when people started advocating for accessibility, inclusion, and equal rights, right, that the language shifted to person-first identity. And then it was in around the late 20th century that identity first really started to emerge as a movement. And I would argue that it's still very much emerging now. In society, people are still very uncomfortable by this idea. As you said yourself, people will look at you in very funny ways when you say that and you self-identify as being disabled.
Yeah, I think these are conversations still ongoing on social media for a reason. And I think that we're inserting our own little conversation here because the point is there is no one perfect way to identify. We're a community of people.
Yeah, and so our identifiers are diverse because we're a diverse community.
Yeah, no two disabilities are the same. Even if you have the same diagnosis, those experiences of that disability are still going to be different because we're different people experiencing things in different ways. So, I think that we're hoping the message you take away from this is however you identify, that's okay. We respect that. We want you to feel like you're in a safe space to identify however feels most comfortable for you.
And we encourage that. And we'd love to hear more about how you identify. So please feel very comfortable to reach out to us.
Yeah. And, you know, I think this has been a great episode. And we'd love to see you back in a fortnight's time for episode 4.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. And I hope that you have a wonderful a wonderful fortnight.
Yeah. And we'll see you soon.
See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.